friend of mine once asked me, what movies did I think had the best acting?
Yeah, there are the usual suspects of great singular performances, but approaching the question from an overall ensemble standpoint, and setting aside the obvious answer, Doubt immediately came to mind. It's not hard to see why. You have quite possibly the best actress ever working at the top of her game. One of the best actors of his generation working at the top of his game. One of the best and most underappreciated actresses working today, delivering an understated performance. And a devastating breakout performance from a then unknown Viola Davis, who was nominated for an Oscar despite being in just one scene, though it certainly helps that in her one scene she outperforms Meryl Streep. But in addition to the stellar cast, and the fact that all four were nominated for Oscars, the movie itself emphasizes the performances by the nature of the story. The mystery at the center of the narrative isn't solved by the narrative, so the audience is forced to look for possible clues in the performances. Every nuance, every glance, every subtle choice is scrutinized and expounded. John Patrick Shanley, the writer-director of the movie and writer of the original play, has said that the last act of his play takes place after the play is over, when the audience is discussing what they just saw. Two people can watch the same play or movie and walk away with vastly different interpretations of what happened. As someone who loves nothing more than dissecting, analyzing, and talking about movies, of course I'm going to be fond of a movie that demands to be dissected, analyzed, and talked about. Because, if nothing else, the movie is a litmus test, revealing biases in the audience depending on which conclusion is drawn. It poses an unanswerable question, and regardless of how much the viewer may be convinced of an answer, it is left decidedly unanswered. When I saw the movie in theaters, I was completely sure that Father Flynn was guilty of what Sister Aloysius accused him of. As she says in the final scene,
his resignation was his confession.
That was good enough for me. It wasn't until later that I learned that Shanley wrote the play and the movie to be intentionally open-ended. So I watched much more carefully on my second viewing, and I paid close attention to what isn't left open-ended, to what we know for sure. And all we know for sure is that Father Flynn met with Donald Miller privately, Donald returned acting strangely with alcohol on his breath, and Father Flynn is reassigned to another parish under the threat of Sister Aloysius going public with her accusations. And that's it. Everything else is conjecture. So, let's conjecture. Which apparently is also a verb. The movie opens with Father Flynn giving a sermon about doubt.
What do you do when you're not sure? That's the topic of my sermon today.
This seemingly innocuous topic gives pause to Sister Aloysius.
Is Father Flynn in doubt? Is he concerned that someone else is in doubt?
Causing her to be on high alert. This high alert causes Sister James to report Donald Miller's strange behavior to Sister Aloysius. And because Father Flynn's sermon had already planted the seed in Sister Aloysius' head, she immediately takes this to mean impropriety occurred.
So, it's happened.
If this sounds a bit like an unfounded reaction to you, I don't disagree. When I watched the movie with a new perspective, trying to give Father Flynn the benefit of the doubt, I was actually surprised that that was all it took to convince Sister Aloysius. And I kicked myself for being so sure of Father Flynn's guilt the first time around when that was all there was to go on. Because, surprisingly, that's all the proof, or lack thereof, that Sister Aloysius gets.
You haven't the slightest proof of anything!
But I have my certainty.
That and Father Flynn's resignation. But again, if you come at it from Father Flynn's point of view, even his resignation makes sense.
And on with that, I'll go to your last parish. And the one before that. If necessary, I'll find a parent. Trust me, Father Flynn, I will.
Guilty or not, he knows Sister Aloysius will stop at nothing until his reputation is ruined.
And once I go, I will not stop.
Guilty or not, this is what Father Flynn is up against if he allows her to go public. Guilty or not, he just looks defeated here. Guilty or not, she's won.
Where's your compassion?
Nowhere you can get at it.
Again, I don't bring these points up to prove his innocence, but to show that there's uncertainty. His guilt isn't certain, and his innocence isn't certain. Depending on your point of view, you may view doubt as either Spotlight or The Hunt, but taking at face value, the movie is both and neither. And you can even look for clues beyond the nuanced performances and beyond the script, for example in the cinematography, and you're still left with an unanswerable question. Pay attention to how much Shanley and cinematographer Roger Deakins shoot both Father Flynn and Sister Aloysius from low and high angles. In the low angle, we look up at the character, implying power, dominance, reverence. In the high angle, we look down at the character, judging them, belittling them. Father Flynn is introduced with a high angle, looking down on him. And when we meet Sister Aloysius, we're looking up at her. But then, throughout the movie, we look up at and down on both characters pretty equally. It's like the camera itself can't decide what it thinks about these characters. And it's worth noting that Sister James, i.e. the neutral audience surrogate, caught between these two polar extremes, unsure of what to think of either, is shot at eye level for the most part. But this brings up another point. Movies based on stage plays are often not very cinematic, especially when the playwright is involved in the production, let alone directing. After all, this story was written specifically for the stage. The original play has only 4 characters and takes place in a couple of rooms. And when you really get down to it, the story boils down to 2 conversations between Aloysius and Flynn, one here and another here. That sort of contained story is perfectly serviceable in play form. What's to be gained by making a movie out of it? Besides that, and again, when the playwright is involved in the film's production, yes, you have the benefit of someone who knows the story and the characters inside and out, but you also have someone who might be too close to the material and thus averse to making necessary changes to make it less stagey and more filmy. Luckily, Shanley was acutely aware of this, so he both expanded the script and, more importantly, was able to incorporate some visual storytelling. It also probably didn't hurt that his cinematographer was the great Roger Deakins, whose resume more than speaks for itself and to whom we desperately need to give an Oscar. Doubt the movie utilizes its format and does things Doubt the play couldn't. For example, there are a lot of vertical lines in the frame. Those vertical lines are contrasted by the frequent use of Dutch angles, traditionally used to heighten tension
Happened in the rectory.
Happened.
or to show a character in disarray. This conversation with Mrs. Miller shakes Sister Aloysius to her core.
What kind of mother are you?
This shot right after that conversation shows that visually, as she enters her final confrontation with Father Flynn. Also made possible by the movie format, the wind motif, which Shanley really, really hammers home.
I've never known a wind like it. The wind has changed.
Do you hear that? It's the winds of change.
Also, this beautiful feather imagery, reinforcing Father Flynn's sermon on gossip. Also, one of my favorite lighting cues, when Sister Aloysius opens the window, shining a bright light in Father Flynn's face, interrogation style, and she good cop, bad cops with Sister James.
Which boy?
And of course, the aforementioned low and high angle shots, showing us that even the camera can't decide where it falls on the conflict between these two characters. But as any astute viewer probably noticed, the conflict between Sister Aloysius and Father Flynn goes far beyond what may or may not have happened with Donald Miller.
You don't like it that he uses a ballpoint pen. You don't like it that he takes 3 lumps of sugar in his tea.
And she sees me talking a human way to these kids, and she immediately assumes that there must be something wrong with it. Well, I'm not going to let her keep this parish in the dark ages.
What are you doing in this school?
I'm trying to do good.
They have fundamentally different worldviews, respectively representative of a pre- and post-1964 America. And this is the aspect of Doubt that I think elevates it from a thought-provoking drama to a truly great movie. Now, Father Flynn establishes that the movie takes place in 1964 with his reference to the Kennedy assassination in his opening sermon.
Last year, when President Kennedy was assassinated, who among us did not experience the most profound disorientation?
That date is absolutely crucial in pulling apart this story. It was amidst radical changes in the Catholic Church, the Civil Rights Movement, and second-wave feminism. And it could be argued that 1964 marked a shift in the cultural mindset of Americans. And this movie, sometimes subtly, sometimes overtly, touches on all of these things on some level. I'd say the most overt example is the delineation of Vatican II. As a brief history lesson to any non-Catholic viewers, Vatican II was an ecumenical council called by Pope John XXIII, bringing together thousands of Roman Catholic religious leaders to settle doctrinal issues. It was a very big deal, because it was the first such council in almost 100 years, and because it brought about vast changes in church practices. It lasted from 1962 to 1965, and it's seen as the birth of the modern Catholic Church. Pre-Vatican II, almost all Catholic masses were said in Latin, and the priest faced away from the congregation for most of it. Post-Vatican II, most masses are now performed in the local language, and often the priest faces towards the congregation. That's one example of what Vatican II attempted to change, to bridge the divide between church and church-goer, to allow the church to be more open and accessible in the modern world. So when Father Flynn says things like,
But it might be jolly to include a secular song.
Well, I'm not going to let her keep this parish in the dark ages.
Those are very clearly post-Vatican II ideas. And when you hear dialogue like,
It's a new time, sister.
There is nothing new under the sun.
The church needs to change.
you're supposed to connect that to the fact that this movie takes place in 1964 and say, aha, Vatican II. Sister Aloysius is old school, holding on to older church ideas, and Father Flynn is new school, embracing the modernization.
We should be friendlier. The children and the parents should see us as members of their family.
But we are not members of their family. We're different.
Hell, even Sister Aloysius' habit is narrower than Sister James's or the other nuns. She literally has a narrow worldview. Where Father Flynn is warm and friendly, Sister Aloysius is cold and severe.
Children should think you have eyes in the back of your head.
Wouldn't that be a little frightening?
Only to the ones who are up to no good.
But it's worth noting, she's not wrong on that point. Same here.
Was it spontaneous?
What?
His nosebleed?
What else would it be?
Self-induced.
You mean you think he might have intentionally given himself a nosebleed?
Donald Miller sighed. This creates a large rift between her and Father Flynn. This tension between them is about more than just Donald Miller. One thing that many progressive people were hoping would come out of Vatican II was an increased role of women in the church. The Sisters of Charity had vows of piety and vows of silence, only allowed to speak at dinner if the Mother Superior rang the bell. The male priests had no such vows of piety or silence.
Fat!
But Vatican II didn't change enough for women in some people's minds. For example, to this day, women still can't be Catholic priests. And religious women's glass ceiling is worse than secular women's glass ceiling. As such, since 1966, there's been a 72.5% drop-off of women religious in the United States. Vatican II wasn't enough, so women left. So when Sister Aloysius threatens to leave the church,
I will step outside the church! If that's what needs to be done, though the door should shut behind me!
that's very predictive. Outside of the church, second-wave feminism was beginning in the early 60s, lasting until the 1980s-ish. And yeah, while second-wave feminism may not have had women in the clergy high on the priority list, it feels like it's at least worth mentioning. After all, the limited power of women in the church figures into the plot.
Here, there's no man I can go to. Men run everything. We are going to have to stop him ourselves.
Sister Aloysius notes that Father Flynn may be in doubt,
He was talking about doubt.
Why?
which, in the pre-Vatican II church, was basically hearsay and a very big deal. But the sisters couldn't do anything about it. It wasn't their place to question him or to go over his head and report him.
No, that would not be appropriate. He is my superior, and if he were troubled, he should confess it to a fellow priest or to the Monsignor. We do not share intimate information with priests.
This brings up what Shanley calls the story not being told. With the now well-documented decades of abuse by some priests, see Spotlight, priests who were doing bad things were being moved around from parish to parish, see The Ending of Doubt. Which means someone had to have told on them. Shanley assumes it was the nuns. They were the teachers and school administrators. They were in the thick of things with the children. While they weren't in positions of power to do anything about it, they were likely the ones to notice and report the problems, like Sister James. That's probably why Sister Aloysius tells Father Flynn that she called a nun, not a priest, at his old parish.
I spoke to a nun.
You should have spoken to the pastor.
I spoke to a nun.
Nuns knew things. They just weren't able to do anything about it.
You have no right to act on your own. You have taken vows, obedience being one.
Even Mrs. Miller is aware of Sister Aloysius' predicament as a woman in the church.
Sister, you ain't going against no man in a robe and wind. He's got the position.
But if you jump back about 5 seconds, she actually touches on both the women's issue and the race issue in the same breath.
So you're giving my son the blame. No problem, my son getting blamed, and you know why that is.
You should let me talk.
Sister,
What she's obviously alluding to in that first line is the color of Donald's skin. Again, 1964. Right around the time of the Civil Rights Act of 1957, the Civil Rights Act of 1960, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Civil Rights Act of 1968. Donald Miller is the only black student at this school.
Our first Negro student.
And Sister Aloysius is aware of the difficulty he faces.
Has anyone hit him?
No.
Someone will.
What she isn't aware of is how much Mrs. Miller is willing to look past in order to get Donald through school.
Let him have him then. What? It's just till June.
Keep in mind, in 1964, the high school graduation rate for white students was nearly double that of black students.
If Donald can graduate from St. Nicholas, he has a better chance of getting into a good high school. And that would mean an opportunity at college.
So the prospect of college is worth absolutely anything to this working class mother. There's a good chance Mrs. Miller would have reacted very differently to this implication if the story had a modern setting, but this is a conversation between two helpless people, bound by their race, their gender, and their church. And it profoundly changes Sister Aloysius. She thinks she knows what it means to be a mother.
Excuse me, but you don't know enough about life to say a thing like that, sister.
I know enough.
But as she learns, she knows nothing. This shakes her to her core, as John Patrick Shanley uses a Dutch angle immediately after, calling it the existential nausea of a woman entering a new time. And honestly, she's not alone. Like I said before, it could be argued that 1964 marked a shift in the cultural mindset of Americans, beginning with the Kennedy assassination in November of 1963. That was the transition from Eisenhower's 1950s to Johnson and Nixon's 1960s. The hope, optimism, and economic boom of post-war America, embodied by JFK to a lot of people, was replaced by paranoia and distrust and stagflation after JFK's death. Vietnam, counterculture, Watergate, conspiracy theories, assassinations of JFK, Dr. King, Malcolm X, Robert Kennedy. When Father Flynn says in his opening sermon,
There was a time of people sitting together, bound together by a common feeling of hopelessness.
yeah, that sounds about right. The hope and optimism of post-war America seemed like a distant memory. Keep in mind that World War II had definitive good guys and definitive bad guys. Americans had not only hope, but also certainty that what our government was doing was the right thing to do. Then, suddenly, we find ourselves in a very unpopular war and unable to trust our politicians. You could argue that the US hasn't since been involved in a war with such clearly defined morality, and many people haven't since been able to trust our politicians. And the certainty that Americans felt in the 1950s was replaced with John Patrick Shanley says that the play and the movie are about the struggle to be certain in an uncertain world. Sister Aloysius is facing the possibility that one of her students is being sexually abused on her watch, and yet, she can't be sure.
I have doubts.
She can't be sure about what Father Flynn may have done. She can't be sure that what she did was right. She can't be sure about the state of her church. She can't be sure about the state of her country. She's voicing the uncertainty of women, of African Americans, and of Americans as a whole. Shanley says that the grief of this final scene is the grief of nostalgia, the grief of what's lost. Whether she's right about Father Flynn or not, Sister Aloysius is an anachronism, desperately trying to hold on to a time gone by, a time when she could be certain about the world.
I have such doubts.
Sister, you care for sugar?
Never.